Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to Regulator Books. It's a pleasure to be here in North Carolina. Foreign Policy in Focus is on the web at fpif.org, and I do a regular column there every week, so I encourage you to go there and check out the work we do. Tonight, I thought, I'll be talking about my book, Crusade 2.0, which is about Islamophobia and its effects here in the United States and in Europe, published by City Lights, great press. And instead of reading from the book, I thought I would just do a presentation for you in 4 parts. And the 4 parts are going to be a visit, a poem, an email, and then finally a political ad. But let's start with the visit. A couple weeks ago, I went up to New York City and I visited Park 51, which is an interesting Islamic cultural center. And there I saw the different programs that they have available. They teach Arabic, they teach calligraphy, they have a course on capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial art. It was a fascinating, it occurs to me you might not know what I'm talking about, because you might not recognize Park 51, the actual name Park 51, because you might be more familiar with the name that it was used in the media to describe Park 51, which is, of course, the Ground Zero Mosque. And it was 2 years ago that this Islamic cultural center, not a mosque, and not really located at Ground Zero, but several blocks away, became the focus of a great controversy. I don't know if you remember that 2 years ago, but there were huge protests in New York City and counter-protests. And perhaps you remember some of the signs that appeared on the streets of New York, protesters against this Ground Zero Mosque. Some of the signs said, "Stop Islam. Islam kills. The meek shall inherit Islam, and Islam is a lie." When I visited Park 51, the official name, of course, there were no protests. There were no protesters outside, no ugly signs. It was just a place where different people from different faiths and different traditions came together to study, to meet each other. So where did all the protests go? Well, one of the reasons I think that the protests disappeared in front of Park 51 was a photography exhibit that opened up Park 51, finally, in September of last year. And what was that photography exhibit? Was it something about bloodthirsty Islam, or was it about the terrible crimes that Islam has perpetuated, or was it about Islam taking over the world? The photography exhibit that opened up at Park 51 was a photography exhibit by a Jewish photographer taking photographs of all the children of New York who come from different countries. I think the protests disappeared in front of Park 51 because the protesters realized that their picture of the quote-unquote Ground Zero Mosque was so different from the reality that the organizers were talking about all the time, an Islamic cultural center that would have photography exhibits by Jewish photographers about children from all around the world. So the protests have disappeared from in front of Park 51. And the Islamophobes have gone on to other targets. They've been targeting halal meats, for example, this year. But the messages, in many ways, remain the same. Different target, same messages. The message that Islam is inherently violent, that Islam and Muslims are treacherous, and that Islam is trying to take over the world. These are the kind of 3 major stereotypes about Islam. And the message has not only stayed the same over the last couple of years, I would say, and what I argue in my book, Crusade 2.0, is that these messages actually have remained pretty consistent for over 1,000 years. And that brings us to part 2, which is the poem. City Lights, of course, is famous for its poetry. Howell, Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, so I felt it was important to incorporate a poem in tonight's presentation. And the poem is an epic poem that takes place in the mountains of Spain over 1,000 years ago. And it memorializes a great epic battle between the forces of Christianity and the forces of Islam. The battle took place in 778, and it involved Charlemagne and the forces of Islam, the Moorish armies, and Charlemagne's nephew, Roland. And the poem, of course, is the Song of Roland, the great medieval chanson, French poem, medieval poem, that memorializes what happened to Roland and the army of Charlemagne. Because on that fateful night in 778, as 20,000 Frankish troops of Charlemagne's army were coming back from Spain after battling the forces of Islam, as they were going through the mountains, they were attacked from behind by the Moorish army, and they were slaughtered, all 20,000 of them, including Roland, the great nephew of Charlemagne. And it is an epic battle, and it has inspired many people over the years, and it is a core text in Western civilization classes, and it is wrong. Because in fact, in 778, it wasn't the Moorish armies that attacked Charlemagne and Roland from behind. It wasn't Muslims at all. It was Christians. It was Christian Basques from the city of Pamplona, which we know today for the running of the bulls. And the Christian Basques were furious at Charlemagne's armies because they had promised that they would not loot the city of Pamplona if the Basques opened up the gates and invited them in. And the Franks came into the city of Pamplona and they looted it. And the Basques were angry. So they came after Charlemagne's army, and in 778, in the mountains of Spain, they did defeat those 20,000 Franks. So what happened? I mean, what happened between 778, when the battle took place, and the mid-11th century, when the Song of Roland was committed to paper? What peculiar game of telephone took place in which the people on one end said, Basques, 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 and somehow on the other end of the telephone, it came out as Muslims? Why did this take place, and how did this take place? Well, there are three major reasons. One is, it was necessary to simplify the tale, because in 8th century, the battles taking place between Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Moorish armies in Spain were extremely complicated. And in fact, Charlemagne was aligned with several Moorish armies against other Moorish armies. And in fact, at the time, Charlemagne had a pretty good relationship with the Caliph in Baghdad. But that's a complex story, and it was necessary to simplify it. Kind of like Coney 2012, that video. Necessary to simplify a very complicated story into something that could be sung with passion by the bards of the time. Number two, it was important to make it into an epic. It's not an epic if it's Basques against Franks. Christian on Christian violence. Not epic. Epic is a world historical struggle between Christianity and Islam. And finally, there was an anxiety, I would say. An anxiety in the Christian European world at the time. An anxiety that the very qualities that were being imputed to these Muslims who attacked Charlemagne, who in fact didn't attack Charlemagne, but the Moorish army, that they were violent and treacherous and were about and always wanted to take over the world, that this anxiety among Christian Europeans was in fact a feeling that maybe despite all the teachings of peace and love in the New Testament,